Their place looks like an accident waiting to happen. Safeco doesn't think responsible people should pay for the carelessness of others. So, if you're tired of having your insurance bills go out of sight, don't walk but run to your nearest independent Safeco agent. After all, it's the people we don't insure that make Safeco such a good deal for those we do. At Safeco, we think careful people deserve to save.
I'm Ed Bradley. What we want to do in this next hour is tell you something of what's happened to Cambodia. To do that, CBS News has been to Belgrade in Yugoslavia, to Paris, London, Washington, New York, Hong Kong, Bangkok, and a number of refugee camps here in Thailand. We have talked to experts, advocates, officials, and the only people to leave the country, Cambodian refugees. We have also obtained rare film, pictures of Cambodia made in the spring of this year by a Yugoslav television team that gave us a look into that country that 3 years ago pulled the curtains and shut out virtually all foreigners. Quite a bit of this broadcast will be devoted to that film and what it shows us. What we've been unable to do is cross this border and get a first-hand look at what has happened. Phnom Penh was the favorite capital for many of us who covered the war in Southeast Asia. It was a city that offered so much more than Saigon or Vientiane in Laos. I used to look forward to visits there. The people were kind, gentle, and friendly. Particularly in the early days, the war seemed so far away from life in this city. There was graceful Cambodian architecture, art and dance that were born centuries ago, and a people who loved living. It used to be said that the greatest pleasures for the Cambodians were making love, listening to the wind, and watching the rice grow. Before the war, the capital was a tranquil urban center, stocked with an abundance of food and about 600,000 people. By the end, it was choked with refugees, its population swollen to almost 3 million as people fled from the war that had swept through the countryside to the very outskirts of the city. Today, you don't see refugees in Phnom Penh. You don't see many people either. And by day, none is visible in the city's empty and shuttered streets. What you are looking at, and what we will see a good deal more of, is the film made by the Yugoslavs. They were in what is now called Democratic Kampuchea on a 2-week guided tour. This is some of what the Yugoslavs saw and how they described it.
Phnom Penh, capital city of Kampuchea, 1978. This country, formerly known as Cambodia, has a population of between 7 and 8 million, says its government. Since the triumph of the communist revolution 3 years ago, the towns and cities are uninhabited. The shops and markets are closed. Kampuchea is being turned into a completely new society where money and salaries have now been abolished. The vaults in the ruins of the National Bank have not yet been opened. Money will be reintroduced, says Prime Minister Pol Pot, if the people consider it necessary. But when will passenger traffic be re-established? How long will the streets be nameless tracts of stone and asphalt? How long will the towns and villages be without postal service? No official answer is given. Where are the inhabitants of Phnom Penh, Takeo, Battambang, and Kompong Chom? Where are the inhabitants of other towns, big and small? They are scattered throughout Kampuchea, in cooperatives, at building sites. They are no longer in towns.
To understand what's happened to Cambodia, you have to understand the American role there. The Vietnam War and American policy ravaged the country. The United States secretly bombed Cambodia, striking at North Vietnamese targets which were just across the border. Prince Sihanouk, as Chief of State of Cambodia, had played the Americans against the North Vietnamese in a delicate and dangerous juggling act, an attempt to keep his country neutral in the Indochina War. But in 1970, when Sihanouk was out of the country, Lon Nol, one of his generals, led a military coup to depose him. With American backing, Lon Nol became the chief of state. Now, although he did not disclose the secret U.S. bombing, the President of the United States did announce publicly that combat troops would move across the border.
Tonight, American and South Vietnamese units will attack the headquarters for the entire communist military operation in South Vietnam. This key control center has been occupied by the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong for 5 years in blatant violation of Cambodia's neutrality. This is not an invasion of Cambodia.
Voices of protest were raised across the United States. At Kent State, National Guardsmen opened fire without warning, killing 4 students and wounding 9. 2 students were killed in another demonstration at Jackson State, and 12 were wounded. Nixon agreed to withdraw the American troops, but the secret bombing continued. Between 1970 and 1973, almost 500,000 tons of bombs were dropped on the Cambodian countryside and its population. Some $3 billion was poured into the country, most of it in military aid, and much of it was siphoned off by a growing class of corrupt government and military officials. But as in Vietnam, all of the American efforts failed. In 1975, when the Cambodian communists, the Khmer Rouge, started their annual dry season offensive, it was apparent that this one would succeed. Most of the countryside was already under communist control. The Lon Nol government held out only in the capital and a few key provincial cities. The lifeline to Phnom Penh had been the Mekong River and the convoys which brought in food, fuel, and ammunition. But Khmer Rouge gunners on the riverbanks made ship traffic impossible. So with the provincial highways already cut, the railroad line to Thailand severed, and now the Mekong River closed to traffic, the American airlift was the last hope. Cargo planes flew in 650 tons a day, fuel and ammunition for the war, some rice for the refugees. But the flow of food into the city was not enough to feed a population which now numbered nearly 3 million people. Children and their parents were starving to death. Soldiers lay wounded in the fields for hours. Medical supplies were scarce or unavailable, as were helicopters to evacuate the wounded. Many of those choppers were used by officers and others with money to flee the country. There were daily evacuation flights, but not for peasants. Diplomats started to leave. Australia, Indonesia, Thailand, and Malaysia closed their embassies. And then the original colonialists, the French, pulled out. On April 1st, 5 years after the coup, Marshal Lon Nol left the war and his country. That left only the Americans, and not for long. Early on the morning of the 12th of April, the word came to those of us in Phnom Penh. The United States Embassy was lowering its flag. After 5 years, billions of dollars, tons of bombs, and a war that cost more than 600,000 lives, the American presence was to end. Somehow it seemed ironic that morning watching American soldiers in full combat gear set up a defense perimeter to protect the evacuation, as only children gathered around the edge of the soccer field to watch the Americans and a very small number of the Cambodians who worked for them leave. But there were millions of Cambodians who couldn't or didn't want to leave their country. And they were victims again. Some of them caught under rocket and artillery fire, or trapped in savage street fighting as the Khmer Rouge tightened their grip around Phnom Penh. On April 17th, the Khmer Rouge arrived in the heart of the city. Government troops turned in their weapons. These soldiers who had never seen a city before sampled simple pleasures. But suddenly it changed. The order came to evacuate the city. Now, everyone. The Americans, they said, were going to bomb. People took what they could carry, but the Khmer Rouge stopped cars to search or confiscate them, taking what they needed or wanted. Soon the streets were choked with refugees, streaming towards the bridges and out of the city. Francois Ponchot, a French priest, lived in Cambodia for 10 years. He told me the evacuation was total.
About 11 o'clock, we saw a scene that was utterly unimaginable. The wounded and sick leaving on the road. With my own eyes, I saw families pushing hospital beds along the road. The serum still flowing into the patients. People with neither legs nor arms crawling, moving like worms. I saw that with my own eyes.
There are few who would argue the severity of the evacuation, but for whatever reasons, and in spite of the suffering and hardship incurred, it did accomplish its purpose. It put the entire population in the countryside. We'll be back to take a look through the Yugoslav film at this new society, the people and their way of life. What we're about to see now is more of that Yugoslav film, some of what they saw in the countryside during their 2-week guided tour. Obviously, in permitting the first foreign newsmen, even fellow communists, to see their new society, the leaders of Kampuchea wanted to put forward their best image. But I think this film will show you a lot more about life in Kampuchea than they intended. Again, the words of the Yugoslavs.
Today, the people of Kampuchea live and work in the countryside. According to official estimates, at least 2.5 million Kampucheans are at work building reservoirs and canals as part of a huge national irrigation system. The country's priority is to expand rice production, for the official slogan is, if you have rice, you can have everything you need. Rice earns foreign currency with which to import the necessary oil and, above all, farm machinery. Every grain of rice, in a country which does not recognize the role of money, is worth its weight in gold. All Kampucheans, whether they were town dwellers or peasants, are today living in cooperatives. All the land, cattle, everything is owned by the cooperative. Many cooperatives make products which they barter with neighboring cooperatives for other goods. From their communal dining room emerge members of the cooperative. They are provided with one suit of traditional black clothing a year. The cooperative cares for everything. Within the cooperative, they live, work, bear children, and die. When a man and a woman fall in love, they have to ask cooperative committee to approve the marriage. The committee, which comprises Communist Party members, is headed by a veteran revolutionary. A decision is made over whether the young people are mature enough to marry. There will be no ceremony, religious or civil. Ever since women fought alongside men during the revolution, they've been considered as equals. There is no strict division of labor. But today, while the men serve as soldiers on Kampuchea's borders, it is women who do most of the productive work. On the south coast, 5,000 women work in a salt-producing cooperative which has a revolutionary tradition. Most of the workers are unmarried. Even the married women are separated from their husbands who work elsewhere. They meet only occasionally. Everyone must get up at 5 in the morning and work for 9 hours a day. They rest for 3 days a month when they have to attend political courses. The sea here has no romantic association. It is the source of life, a place to work in. For those barefoot boys in Kampong Som, whose age is difficult to tell, although they are certainly hardly over 12, the sea is a place for production. They are members of the crew of one of the fishing boats anchored in a Kampuchean seaport, formerly called Sihanoukville. With some help from the older hands, they work as fishermen, telegraphists, even junior officers. They seemed never to have played games like other children. A large new warehouse is being built. It is the work of peasants and workers. How much do workers earn? There are no wages, was the answer. A factory of mechanical engineering. Water pumps are the principal products. But who are these boys and girls who can hardly reach the machines? The official answer is they are the children of the revolution. The boys and girls have come from various parts of the country. Officially, the average age is 17. Unofficially, much lower. This is a school for electricians. All the former high schools and universities are closed. The words intellectual and expert are used with hesitation, if at all. In this way, the revolution brings up its children and educates the new working class of Kampuchea. Dams and canals have become a kind of obsession with present-day Kampuchea. Here in Battambang province, there are 20,000 working on a dam. Who are these thousands of young people at the building sites? Where do they come from? How do they live? Where do they live? They are members of 2 neighboring cooperatives which are building the dam jointly. When they complete their task, they will go back to their villages, to their cooperatives. 1/3 of the workers are members of mobile brigades. For them, there is no rest. When they complete their work, they are expected at another building site, at another dam. Amongst people we approached, knowledge of French and English had been forgotten, replaced by new knowledge, political education. There has been a revolution in Kampuchea's culture. It is official policy that old colonial and imperialist culture must be wiped out. Radio provides the link between government and people, broadcasting revolutionary music and political speeches. There are no cinemas or theaters in Kampuchea. There is a television station, but it is not operated. Here we see the only cultural ensemble in the country, which faithfully reflects the ideological, political, and national aspirations of the new Kampuchea.
That film is revealing, but no picture could tell the whole story of what's happened there. Certainly not the film made by the Yugoslavs during their visit. So we thought we'd talk with a lot of people with a wide range of opinion, some who've lived in Cambodia or studied its history or covered its war, to gather their impressions of what's happened there. Daniel Burstein is the spokesman for a small fringe group of pro-Chinese communists in the United States. He and 3 others were allowed into Kampuchea for a week shortly after the Yugoslavs. His is the only completely uncritical appraisal we found.
I think the biggest impression we got was of a country in which a whole new society is being built. Everywhere you go, there's just tremendous energy and enthusiasm for carrying out the main tasks on the agenda of the day, which are primarily agricultural tasks, and really for the first time the people have enough to eat. And just that enthusiasm and that kind of spirit, the cooperative efforts of the people to solve the very complicated problems they have left over from a very oppressive old society.
That euphoria was not shared even by Gareth Porter of the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, co-author of a book sharply critical of U.S. policy in Indochina and sympathetic to the Cambodian Revolution. I asked if he was satisfied with what was going on in Kampuchea today.
No, I'm not happy with it at all. I think that there's enormous, there still are enormous problems. I think that there's still suffering. Effects from the war itself, as well as the effects of policies of the new regime. My only plea is for some degree of balance in assessing the human suffering that undoubtedly still exists in Cambodia. I do feel that in the future Cambodia is going to modernize. It's going to be an industrial industrialized society, for a third world country, and that they will, in fact, end that kind of suffering over the next decade or so.
Anthony Paul, an Australian journalist based in Hong Kong, is the author of a book on Cambodia called Murder of a Gentle Land. The title pretty much sums up his perspective. My colleague, Peter Collins, asked Paul to characterize what is happening in Cambodia.
Staggering new development. Genocide in the past has been the action of one race upon another. But what the Cambodians appear to have invented is auto-genocide, where one race kills half or even more than half of its own race. Auto-genocide, I think, would be the phrase.
What's your current estimate of the number of people who have died in Cambodia since 1975 for whatever reason?
If we stick to a conservative estimate, we think that probably between 1.8 million and, say, 2.2 million are dead as a consequence of policy or as a consequence of executions to the present time.
Tiziano Terzani is an Italian who reports for a German news magazine. Recently, he toured the combat areas on the borders between Vietnam and Kampuchea and talked with Cambodian refugees there. He told Peter Collins that questions about the numbers of people who have died in the revolution missed the point.
I think that somehow we have to get away from this question. I mean, we have to find the principle. Was there a policy, a deliberate policy, to eliminate all the people who work for Lon Nol, all the soldiers, all the officers, all the officials in the administration, all the teachers, all the engineers, the few people who have been educated abroad? Was there that policy? If that policy was there, then the figures go up, but the principle is appalling. Then whether it's 800,000, 900,000, 1 million, it doesn't make a big difference to me. If that policy was established, it's enough.
But was the policy established?
In my view, it was.
Carl van Wolferen, a Dutch journalist, has also just come back from the Vietnam-Cambodian border. Peter Collins talked to him in Bangkok.
Life in Cambodia, from the accounts of the refugees, is so bad that it is really beyond words. No description that I have read can do justice to what you feel as you're talking with these people. There have been several waves of killings last year. In May and in September and in December, there were a lot of executions. But besides that, it's hunger. They get less to eat than they did in 75 and in 76. Although in some areas, apparently the harvests have been good and they have a surplus, people are given less to eat.
How much specifically would a person in Cambodia get to eat from what you heard?
In one camp, I spoke to some people who came from the same village, and they all said that they got only 1 tin of rice a day. That's not really just pure rice, that's mixed, it's gruel, mixed with sort of rice soup.
William Shawcross, a British journalist, is currently finishing a book on Cambodia. He is a longtime critic of U.S. Indochina policy, but when I talked to him in London, he did not dispute President Carter's contention that Cambodia was now the world's greatest violator of human rights.
I think it probably is. I mean, again, one can only estimate how great the violation of human rights has been. As I say, the bulk of the evidence seems to me to show that it has been enormous. I think that in terms of people who have died in Cambodia in the last 3 years, it's probably, and during the war, of course, itself, it's probably far greater than in any other country of the world at this moment.
The source of most information about what life is like over there in Kampuchea comes from refugees who risk their lives to cross the border. Their story next.
This could be public enemy.
There is no easy exit for Cambodians. To cross the border or to escape into Vietnam, they must pass through jungle or forests, over mountains or across open land, avoiding mines, booby traps, and government patrols.